I haven't been back here in 52 years. When there was a 50th anniversary a couple of years ago, I was sick and couldn't make it back, which was a disappointment because all of the political people basically came back to see each other after that many years. But I just want to start off with one particular story to give you a feel for how vastly different the university was in those days. And a very important person, political influence on students at this campus, was Chairman Fred Hampton of the Black Panther Party in Chicago. Chairman Fred spoke twice there must be a large hall in social science somewhere. And both times that was completely filled, standing room only. And he really, his father had worked at International Harvester. He came from a working class family, as opposed to some of the other Panthers that were more from the streets. He had a much more of a working class, view of what proletarian revolution was about. And he was a powerful leader. He looked at us students and he said, "How many of you here are radicals?" And everybody's nodding their head. And he says, "How many of you here are revolutionaries, willing to dedicate your life to making a real difference?" And he said, "Remember what I tell you, they can kill a revolutionary, but they can't kill the revolution." And not many months later, he was murdered by the FBI and the Chicago police. An informant had drugged him, and they murdered him in his sleep. And there were tremendous protests on the campus, very violent, after they killed him. I mean, every building had, "Avenge Fred's death" spray painted on it. And not long after that, Bobby Rush, who's now a congressman, who became head of the Black Panther Party in Chicago, was coming up to speak to the students after Fred's death. And I was assigned from the SDS, or Students for Democratic Society, which was a large organization of 100,000 students nationally, high school and college. And I was assigned to do security for the Panthers, which meant that I dressed appropriately, which was all black leather, pants, tam, and jacket, and went to pick up two Panthers security guards and the deputy defense minister at the Madison airport. And they got out of the airport and sat down, and they each took a pistol out of their briefcase and shells out of their bag. Because in those days, you could carry a gun if you didn't have the shells and the pistol in the same place. And they loaded up their guns. And, I said, wow, this is not your usual experience. And so I went like 35 miles an hour, it was like dead on the spot, 45, 35 till we got to campus. But yesterday with my wife, Isabel, we went to look at where they spoke. And it was in the Great Hall in the Student Union. And we walked around the side by the science building, and there was a metal door that I remembered. When we got to the Union for the speech, I pulled up beside that metal door. People had opened it from the inside. I got a shotgun out of the back trunk of the car, and I walked in, leading them to the Great Hall, carrying a shotgun. And during the next hour, I stood on stage next to Calvin, who was the Deputy Minister of Defense, with a shotgun on my hip, and saying to myself, wow, this is not going to be a good scene if this is when they decide to take somebody else out, because I'm standing right up here. Then my second thought was, oh my God, what do I tell my father tomorrow when I'm kicked out of the school? Because they're not going to let me do this and keep going to class, but nothing, luckily there were no cell phones, so there were no pictures. So nothing ever happened. I didn't have to explain to my poor father, who had worked his way out of poverty so I could go to university, why his son had gotten kicked out so quickly in his career. But so that gives you a little feel that just how different things were, that would happen, and without a blink of an eye, there'd be 500 students there listening to the speech, really inspired by the Panther Party. So to start off with, I just wanted to read a short section from the introduction of the book. I wasn't looking forward to the call, but it felt inevitable. Just the day before, I'd undergone an emergency scan to ascertain the cause of the incessant pain nagging in my abdomen. Most days I reported to work at Rock River Music in San Francisco, but found myself resting my head on my desk for hours, overcome by debilitating pain and nausea. Though I know the phone would ring, the piercing sound triggered a visceral reaction. Hello, Jonathan. Dr. Abel here. Good morning, Dr. Abel. I guess you have news. I do, Jonathan, but it's not what we had hoped for. The scans indicate a tumor on the tail of your pancreas. It's malignant. We need to immediately get you into surgery. This is quite serious, but we'll do our best. Do our best. That didn't seem very reassuring. So I had two young children who were 4 and 7 years old. And I had never thought about writing a book or writing my memoirs. And my kids started asking me these questions when they were told that I only had 6 months to a year. And they said, Dad, in college, were you really a bodyguard for the Black Panthers? Dad, why did you go to work in a factory after graduating college? It's killing you now. Why did you go up to an Indian reservation, Menominee Reservation, when you could have been killed by the police? Did you get cancer from working in factories? What kind of factories did you work in? Was it dangerous? What is a union like? Did you really get sued for $4 million? So I decided that in the time I had left, I would start writing so that I could leave a legacy, an understanding for my children and hopefully my children's children of why I had done with my life what I did. Not just what I had done, but there were roughly 10,000 students from campuses all over the country that went to work in factories in that period to continue the organizing we had done. We thought we were going to change the world. And to change the world, it couldn't be done just on college campuses, but that had to be done among the working class that had the power, the organization, and the unions to bring about real substantive change. To understand me a little bit better, I grew up in the 1950s in Washington, D.C., which was very much like being in the apartheid South. I mean, it was really a Jim Crow city divided by quadrants. My first memory as a young kid is, you know, how your family, well, in those days, it was kind of a luxury to have a car. When we got our first, Chevrolet Impala, we'd go out to Virginia, and on the side of the road, I saw a chain gang with black and white stripes of all Black prisoners working on the road. And behind them were like white guards, big with shotguns, the whole paraphernalia. And it was, as a kid, this was like, sort of striking, I mean, this is a visceral image of, what is this? And in 1960, we used to go to an amusement park, Glen Echo, which was in Maryland. And Glen Echo, I didn't realize this at the time, was all white. And in 1960, the Black students from Howard University in DC picketed the amusement park to integrate it. And white racists came out of the countryside in Maryland to put up a fight against integrating the park. And they began to brutalize the Black students who were picketing. And in the end, they threw bleach in the pool so that none of us could swim. And as a kid, it was like, it's 100 degrees here in DC, and now none of us can swim. And what did we care that there were Black kids in the pool with us? It made no sense. But this is really becomes imprinted on you that there's this fundamental rift in society between races. And then in 1964, 3 civil rights workers, Schwerner, Cheney, and Goodwin, were murdered in Mississippi. They were arrested by the police and then let out the back door and given to the Klan to take away. And the Klan killed them and buried them in a bog in Mississippi. And after that death, I was 14, and I said, well, that could have been me. They're only a few years older than I am. So I went to work for the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, which is one of the leading youth civil rights organizations, more militant, not so much nonviolence. And, I was sending out thousands of letters with, the picture of those 3 young civil rights workers, informing people of, the effort to win the vote for Black people in the South, which of course is once again endangered, which is really to think back that we thought we had won that battle, back when the 65 Civil Rights Act was passed. But, we've gone backwards. And once I got to high school, I went to a high school on a farm in Vermont. It was sort of a hippie school progressive hippie school on a farm. And we had to do all the work, like clean the cow barn and, build the dormitories, which was great for kids who were kind of into that. But I was like a city kid, so that when they'd on Friday nights have square dancing in the barn, I was like, well, this isn't really where I'm coming from, I mean, at least the twist was, a step better than square dancing. But so I became very active while I was a high school student. In 1967, there was a call to shut the induction centers all over the country during the Vietnam War. They were bringing inductees in to send them to Vietnam. And I drove a van load of high school students to Manchester, New Hampshire, to lie down in front of the buses and block them from bringing the draftees to the induction center. Well, when we were lying there, we thought the bus was going to stop because we were being nonviolent, but the bus didn't stop. So we all jumped out of the way and then said, to hell with nonviolence, that doesn't work. And, we began throwing rocks at the bus. And, it was, when we drove into town, it was an old working class city where there were shoe factories, old brick shoe factories. And at that time, the workers had hung banners, better dead than red, and commies go home. And I thought to myself, it's their kids that are going to fight in Vietnam. Shouldn't they be doing what we're doing? Shouldn't they be opposing the war? And that planted a seed that clearly without those workers, you couldn't make the kind of fundamental change that we were looking to make. So it was in a sense, a negative lesson that I took as a, positive impact on what we had to learn to do as our movement became more sophisticated. So I chose to come here, Madison, because at that time, there were 3 campuses that were known for radicalism. Columbia University, where the SDS students had occupied classroom buildings to block the building of a gym in the adjacent Black neighborhood. And that had become very violent. And that's where the Weathermen came out of. University of California, Berkeley, and Madison. And so we had a lot of kids who had already come to Madison, and I decided, that's the place where I want to be. So I got here, and in those days, like I said, on every pole, there were, posters tacked up. And the first one said, SDS meeting, throw ROTC off campus, end the Vietnam War. So I went to the meeting, and they needed a volunteer who was in a ROTC class to get up and disrupt it. So I put my hand up, and I said, yeah, I'll go do that. So that next Monday, the first Monday of classes in Bascom Hall on the first floor, we had the ROTC class. And I let the second lieutenant go on for about 15 minutes. And outside were hundreds of SDS members chanting ROTC off campus. And I interrupted him and I said, you realize that you, the US military, is intervening in a civil war, and that the French already lost in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu and were driven out of the country. Now we're the next colonial power that's trying to, promote imperialism, and we don't want to be in ROTC. And I'm going to tell you, do you know why so many second lieutenants are being shot in the back? And he fell for the bait and he said, no, why? And I said, that's because the soldiers don't want to fight. They don't want to follow the second lieutenants into battle. And in truth, for people who don't know the history, the Vietnam War ended because of the fact that soldiers would not fight. They would go out 100 yards, sit down in the jungle, smoke weed, wait for the day to end, and go back to the base. And that's literally what thousands and thousands of soldiers did. There were 225 underground newspapers put out in the military opposing the Vietnam War. So when McNamara and them finally decided that they couldn't keep going, it was because they didn't have the soldiers, and they instituted the draft. So then they were drafting people like us who were really opposed to the Vietnam War to begin with. So that was, we then marched out and half of us left the class. And the next week, there was a vote held by the Wisconsin Student Association, and the vast majority of freshmen voted ROTC off campus. And they ended mandatory ROTC for all male freshmen for the first 7 weeks of school. So the important lesson is that on this campus, we really took our job of organizing not as reactive, but as proactive. We really educated students to why the Vietnam War was an imperialist war and was not in the interests of the everyday people in the United States. And one of my assignments was to go as a dorm organizer. 3 nights a week, we would go into the dorms and we would go down to Elm Drive. We'd knock on the door. We'd ask, could we come in? We'd come in and we'd ask, could we talk to you about the Vietnam War? And we'd go through a whole historical explanation. And we would do that every night so that students, and those were where all the ag students were primarily. But we were like taking on the job of like really spreading the education of, what we were trying to do on campus. In early 1969, Black students for years had been demanding, the Black People's Alliance had been demanding the introduction of ethnic studies, the introduction of an Afro-American center, and the recruitment and admission of more Black students. There were only 500 Black students out of some 30,000 students then, and I fear that today there's only about 600. So I don't know how much progress is really made, although we did win an African-American center. But as I was mentioning to you earlier, just quickly, on that strike, our tactic was impenetrable picket lines. We had enough students that we would block. It's in the book. There's a good picture with me on the Bascom Hill stairs, and we got row 5 deep so that nobody could go in. And that's when Governor Lucey called in the National Guard, and they brought in armed National Guard with bayonets on their rifles and 50 caliber machine guns on their Jeeps that were circulating on campus. And they moved us off the steps of the buildings with bayonets and opened up the school. So along with the Black students, the white students in SDS, we called for a march on the Capitol that night. And this isn't my reporting. This is the Capital Times or whatever the paper was at that time. There were 10,000 students marching on State Street, almost all white students, demanding Black studies, risking their educations to fight for these demands that we all felt were just and right. So when I hear this critical race theory and that white kids will get really upset if they find out that there was a history of slavery, it's just nonsense. I mean, if people are educated like we work to do, they will come out and a third of the student body join the march that night. I mean, you look back from the Capitol and you could see all the way back to the mall, and it was just packed with students marching. So luckily, I was closely associated with some of the Black students were very nationalistic and didn't want white students as part of the strike, but they had first tried striking with just Black students, but 500 students wasn't enough to make much of an impact. And that's when we all coalesced and were able to shut down the university. Then I was explaining on May 3rd, 1969, we called for a block party on Mifflin Street. And the slogan was, do people know who the Zigzag Man is? Okay, on old papers for rolling joints, there used to be a zigzag man. So that was kind of the symbol of the youth culture. So there was a poster with the zigzag man, and it said, you know, party in the streets, you know, May 3rd, celebrate the students in France who the year before had almost toppled the French government, along with workers who struck at the same time. But it wasn't really meant to be a heavy political event. It was a lot of hippies, a lot of hippies who, you know, were dressed in tie-dye and smoking joints, and they're street dancing in circles. And those of us who are more political are, you don't know what's about to happen. And about 30 police cars arrive on the 400 block of Mifflin Street, and they line up, and I think his name was Captain Thomas, it's in the book, and he announces on the bullhorn, move them off the street. And still the kids are dancing, and the cops are just wading in, and people are bloody, people are, you know, beat up by the police. So at first we were kind of shocked and didn't know what to do, but within a couple hours, it became all full-on battle. You know, we had pushed cars into the street to get behind, and we had piles of rocks, and we were fighting it out with the police. And when they would charge through the barricades, we would go through those back alleys by Mifflin and Bassett, and then come back around behind them and then attack. And then they would run that way after us. And it was so interesting because fraternity students joined, agricultural students joined. I mean, it went on for 3 nights. So every day it would spread around the campus. Tonight, meet on Mifflin Street. And it was really a cultural youth rebellion against the war, against the culture of the 1950s, you know, as part of like, you know, cannabis culture. I mean, the yippies, all of this was like what was happening at the time. And so that began to define the next couple of years was the Mifflin Street Block Party. As I was saying, in 1969, we went through the Black Student Strike. In 1970, the Teaching Assistants Association, the TAA, organized the first union of graduate students in the country and called for a strike. And we, the political students, we all dedicated ourselves to joining the strike. And our slogan was, we're going to be the first on and the last off the picket line with the TAs. So every day we would march across the campus, educating people with a broadsheet on what are the issues, what's a union, what's a scab, why should you boycott classes? And it was the first time people had really learned about a labor struggle. And it was new to them being called scabs if they crossed the picket line. And Teamsters trucks would refuse to cross the lines. So there was this first lesson of, you know, worker solidarity. And it, you know, as it stretched on, it became fairly violent. There must have been some TAs who were back from Vietnam because they were at night shooting out the propane tanks next to the chemistry building. So it was, you know, it was a pretty intense battle. And it was great because when the TAs first met, the biggest issue was professors refused to meet if they called them by their first name. So the professors walked out because the students referred to him like Harvey Goldberg, who was a professor, Harvey, you know, and it was so doctrinaire, the division between, you know, almost different classes, you know, the teaching assistants as opposed to the professors that were held in high esteem. That became, when they finally broke that, they broke the log jam. And after a 2-week strike, they were a 24-day strike. It was the first educational union in the country recognized as a union. And they won significant bread and butter issues like full recognition with bargaining rights, job security, a grievance procedure, and health insurance, which was a huge breakthrough. I mean, today, it's not uncommon to see the professors at Rutgers go out on strike, or to see all 10 campuses out in the UC in California go on strike, but those are all part of what was the breakthrough that occurred here in Madison. Although now, under the Republicans, I guess they've sort of broken up public service unions, which will hopefully come back under the new justice on the Supreme Court. But most of the students were really mostly involved in the anti-war activities. But as Don mentioned, I happened to see a poster that had the Black Eagle of the United Farm Workers. And it said, "Come here, Jesus Salas, president of Obreros Unidos, on organizing migrant workers in Wisconsin, in the canneries and in the fields." And so I decided to go to that. And I became really enthused about supporting that effort. And I signed up to work for 4 months as an organizer, driving Manuel, Jesus' brother, around the state. We'd get a call that a cannery had wildcatted up north, and we'd run up there to try and provide strike support for them. And we also were participating in the boycott of grapes, which I don't know if people know, but there was 22 grape growers were struck by the United Farm Workers and refused to negotiate a contract. And it became a national boycott and then an international boycott to boycott grapes. And here in Madison, we went to speak to a group of United Steelworkers. And when I got to the meeting, here were all these guys with like crew cuts and, these nylon jackets saying United Steelworkers. And I said, man, I'm in the wrong place. This doesn't seem like, my crowd at all. But it was fascinating because at the end, one of them put up their hand and he says, "I make a motion that we show Brother Salas on this Friday at their Kroger's boycott picket line how steelworkers do it." And 40 steelworkers showed up on that Friday at Kroger's, and they all marched into Kroger's. They filled up the shopping carts with groceries with ice cream on the bottom. They went up to the checkout and they left their shopping carts with the ice cream melting on the floor. And they came out singing the union song, Solidarity Forever. And one of the verses in Solidarity Forever is that we shall bring to birth a new world from the ashes of the old. And I said to myself, wow, maybe there's really something to this union thing. Maybe these guys, there's a lot more to what they want to do than just, get paid better wages. And that was my first eye-opening to the union movement and to working class union people. So in 1969, we had spent the summer developing a programmatic way to fight the Vietnam War on campus. Instead of just reacting like was going on in most of the country, they do something in Vietnam and then there would be a protest. We said, let's figure out what are the institutions on this campus that are supporting the war effort. And there were 3. There was the ROTC, which I've talked about. There was the Land Tenure Center, which was doing research on how to suppress peasant rebellions in the Third World. And there was the Army Math Research Center that was doing research on dropping bombs in the jungles and how they euphemistically, they said how many ants will be killed. And it was how many people will be killed if we drop this level of bombing into the jungles of Vietnam. So we demanded that our demands were that all 3 of those institutions be taken off campus because they were a direct effort by the university financially to support the war machine. Well, my second year, the first meeting was called a monster meeting for SDS. 800 students came to that first meeting, which was really incredible. And they all wanted to be part of the movement. Unfortunately, the weathermen heard about the meeting and decided they would come up and turn it into a weathermen meeting. So 8 of them, with black leather jackets, marched into the front, got up on the stage and said, this is now a weathermen meeting. And if you're down for revolution, and if you're a hardcore communist like we are, we're going to march out of here and we're going to tear this fucking campus down. But we knew they were coming. So we had set up a mic in the back of the room. So we cut their mic. We told everybody to turn their chairs around, and we continued the meeting from the back as nobody paid any attention, which was, a criticism I make in the book. Although, these days, as we've all become 60, 70 years old, the weathermen have mellowed. And when I went to Chicago, Bill Ayers, who was one of the leaders of the weathermen, introduced me for my book tour speech, which is somewhat of an ironic twist of things. But after SDS broke up, because of the deep level of sectarianism in the American left, which is really a tragedy, there just seems to be an inability most of the time to not battle sectarian, ideological battles, which leave most people out of the picture. But SDS broke up. And we followed the trend that was called the Revolutionary Youth Movement 2, RYM 2, which had 2 basic principles. One was that upon leaving the university, we would go into the army or the military to fight against the Vietnam War, or we would go into a factory to organize. And we formed an organization called Mother Jones Revolutionary League that had our first meeting in social science, in the Commerce Building. And it was pretty wild. Things in those days, we were playing Street Fighting Man as everybody came in, and there were posters of Chairman Mao Zedong on the walls and AK-47s, and keep in mind, this was at the university. And, it was reported on in the Cardinal that there's a new cadre organization formed on campus. 40 of them will be work group members and 40 will be cadre under democratic centralism, led by a central committee. And that we then broke into different organizing groups. There was the group that was organizing around women's liberation issues. There was the group that was organizing around the Mifflin Street Food Co-op. And every Saturday there'd be a capture the flag game over in the Mifflin Bassett area. There were those of us that went into the dorms 3 nights a week. So everybody was very disciplined, and you were responsible for those areas of work. Luckily, the school kind of had it with me by then, and they said, just go do independent studies for the last year and a half till we can get you out of here. So I didn't have to go to class, and I just did independent studies. One of my great papers was Banana Boat Diplomacy in Latin America, about the United Fruit Company. And 5 years later, somebody told me they were still using my paper to hand in as their paper before the days of the internet. Professors had no way to catch the plagiarism. So I felt very proud of that particular paper. But, so I was put in charge of selling the Panther paper on campus. We had a team to sell it. And we used to sell 350 copies of the Black Panther Party paper on campus and in the Mifflin student community, which was really, quite amazing, considering that the Panther paper was very unabashed. Even though I know him today, Emory Douglas, who was the artist who had gotten out of prison for the Panthers, and he's this very quiet vegan. But in those days, he'd just gotten out of prison, and he used to draw all the cartoons of cops with pig faces and flies buzzing around their head. And that's the paper that, students were buying. Well, that also landed me, and if you want to have an interesting time, you'll go to my website, jonathanmelrod.com, just my name.com. And when I finally got my full FBI file after 4 tries, it was 1,000 pages. And it started in 1969 when they traced a call from my house at 504 Mifflin to the Black Panther Party office in Chicago, lining up distribution of the Panther paper. And that's when I first landed on the FBI radar. but I really made it into a full-time career for them, following me. And as you'll see, getting me, okay, great. Wow, that's plenty of time. So, and I hope I'm not boring people. So probably about 20 of us from Madison went to Milwaukee to work in factories. And in those days, you could get a job in a factory just walking in the door. I mean, everybody was hired. And my first factory that I was in was called Easy Painter in South Milwaukee. And we made paint trays and brush rollers for Sears and Roebuck. And, you know, one of the first assignments was this Chicano brother was my straw boss, sort of like not a foreman, but the one who told me what to do. And he said, Juan, get in the vata and clean it. And the vata was this 20-foot vat made out of concrete, where once you put a part under a punch press, there's a layer of grease on it so that it won't stick to the die when it presses out the imprint of what you're making. Well, that grease has to be burned off of the trays. So it runs through this vata, this vat, which is being infused with trichloroethylene, this chemical. And I looked over at the barrel of trichloroethylene, and it was a red barrel with a skull and crossbones. And I said, you know, Manuel, you know, where's my PPE? Where's my breathing equipment and my, you know, protective equipment? He says, what are you, a sissy? You know, and I mean, you know, again, you didn't come when I tried to say that there's a disclaimer on the language, because I'm talking as it was. And, you know, I said, well, to myself, God, you can't be a sissy if you want to be a worker. So I got into the vat, and within 30 seconds, my head was spinning. I had to jump out, gasp for breath. And for the next 15 minutes, I jumped in and out of that vat with trichloroethylene to clean it out with a dust broom, cleaning out these particulates of TCE, trichloroethylene. Later, when I went to work at the American Motors Corporation, we used to wash our hands in buckets of trichloroethylene to get the grease and the paint off of them. When I was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in 2004, the doctor on the diagnosis wrote specifically, cancer is suffering from pancreatic cancer caused by exposure to industrial toxins, such as trichloroethylene and tanning solvents, because I'd also worked in a tannery when I was fired from AMC. So when I write, you know, on the front lines of the class war, and sometimes people have said to me, well, why do you call it a class war? I said, because it really is a war. When you're in there, they don't want to pay for gloves. You know, they'd rather have you wash your hands in trichloroethylene. And, you know, you're fighting this war for survival every day. You feed your family, you know, you endanger your life. You don't want to endanger your life. You know, there's not much else you can do if you don't have some sort of degree or whatever. So how many minutes did you say?
We finish at 2, so we
okay. All right. Don't worry, guys. I'll be done by then easily. But I knew that I couldn't stay an easy painter. I needed to be in a much more strategic factory. And the most strategic factory that I had heard everybody talking about was the American Motors plant on Richard Street in Milwaukee, a big automobile factory, 5 stories high. And just to tell you why I wanted to go there, in 1969, I didn't start work there until 1972, but in 1969, there had been 13 illegal wildcat strikes in that plant and the Kenosha plant to protest working conditions. And the UAW International Union, the bureaucrats, had tried to get people to go back to work, and then they just walked back out again. So I said, boy, that's where the action's at, you know, and I got hired on at American Motors. And it was great. It was like being at Woodstock. I mean, everybody was young, you know, the young white kids had long hair, platform shoes, you know, the black and brown, you know, guys had just come back from Vietnam, most of them, and they were like rebellious, didn't want to be, they weren't going to let some little skinny white foreman tell them what to do. They had already been through that with their second lieutenant in Vietnam. So the whole world had changed. And there were a lot of black young women for the first time, and many of them were church-going women. And as we began to get organized, they brought their sense of community and organizing skills to our organizing building. In fact, at our first caucus meeting in the union, one of the young women put up her hand. She says, "I'm my church treasurer. I'd like to be our treasurer." So organization came sort of naturally. I mean, the guys in Vietnam knew about organization. The guy in the Woodstock people a little less, took a little harder to get them in line. But the first thing that happened was the company came around and they notified us on a Thursday that you're all going to have to work overtime on Saturday. And we were like flabbergasted. Saturday, I mean, Friday night, we go out to like 2 a.m. How can we go to work on Saturday morning? That's just ridiculous. So I went home and I found a copy of the contract, which the union didn't even give you. You know, I mean, that's how bureaucratic unions can become if allowed to on their own resources. And I found a page that said that all overtime is voluntary. So I went to the Xerox store. How many people know what a Xerox is? Zero. Okay. So it's like Kinko's, okay? And it was a copy machine where I copied that page of the contract. And the next morning, all the young guys were handing it out to everybody. So when they come around on Friday with a steward and a supervisor to instruct you to report on Saturday, you can hear everybody yelling, "I ain't coming in. I don't work Saturdays. Saturday's my time." And they came back around and they notified, "We can't get a workforce because some people have denied other people the opportunity to make overtime." And Melrod, the president of the union, knows it was Melrod and he's going to get it. So that was the first situation where I knew, that I was fighting not only the company, but a certain part of the bureaucracy in the union. Because it came out that the president had promised the company that he would get a workforce because they were selling so many cars. But there was an important principle involved, which is a union principle is, why should you work overtime when there's unemployed people who need jobs? And it forces them to hire more people, and that's the way it should be. Rather than working 60 hours, 20 of them being overtime every week, they should hire more people. The next thing that happened that turned into a mass struggle was that they came around and they notified people that, well, actually, I want to go back a second. I want to describe why American Motors was so different. In our contract at American Motors, we had 3 sets of rights that nobody else in the UAW had. The right to strike over any grievance, the right to voluntary overtime, and one union steward for every 35 people who worked on the assembly line. And that steward only had to work a half hour a day and could be off the next 7.5 hours representing people for union business. So those were rights that used to exist in all of the auto companies before Walter Reuther took over and formed the administration caucus, which then expunged throughout all the leftists, all the communists, all the socialists, all the anarchists. Anybody progressive was expelled from the union, basically. And they then gave up those rights. One year he traded away voluntary overtime for better pay. 1 year was for 2 weeks vacation. So each of those rights were given away, but not at American Motors, where it was a smaller company and the union had much more power and was refused to give it up. So the next thing that happened was that the company announced that they were going to speed up the line by 3 cars an hour, which you have to have been able to have worked on an assembly line to really grasp the difference between 3 more cars an hour. You're doing basically a car a minute. So if you're putting in 2 sets of taillights, that means I've got to put in 6 bolts on the right-hand taillight, 6 bolts on the left-hand taillight, and then go to the next car without a moment's break. And that's all day. And it's really grueling and mind-numbing work. So we got together and we said, what can we do about this? This just doesn't seem right. So we said, let's put out a flyer that says, the contract says you only have to work at a normal pace. So let's tell everybody, work at a normal pace, walk, don't run, fight speed up. And this was new to us, and we had a hand crank mimeograph machine that you had to like turn the crank to print your leaflets. So to print 2,000 leaflets was like a half a night's work. And so we printed out these leaflets, and we, being very democratic in the caucus, there was one line that said, Hitler didn't work people this hard. And being Jewish, I tried to explain to people that the equivalency wasn't really very close. But being a democratic organization, they voted against me. So I decided in the future, we should have a democratic committee that wrote the leaflet. So there was a little more control over editorial control over it. But in any event, so we handed out that leaflet, and it took off like wildfire. The older workers began to come alive, and they taught us how you ride the line. And riding the line means that you do everything that you've been assigned to do with the additional 3 cars. And that meant that by the time I got to where that TV is, I would be out of my workstation, and that person was supposed to put in the rubber around the trunk, but I'd be in their way, so they throw the rubber in the trunk. Then the next guy can't do their job, so they throw their parts in the trunk. And meanwhile, no car is getting built. And like the aisles are filled up with unbuilt cars, the roof is filled up with unbuilt cars. And like, you know, basically there's an insurrection going on, and all the older workers are riding the line and teaching us how to do it. So then that night we got to the house, and by then we had formed something called the Fight Back Caucus, because we wanted to be more organized, and we wanted to show that we were in the union. We were a caucus within the union, not outside the union, challenging the union. It's like a dual union. And so we decided, let's make up T-shirts. So we went to the store, we bought a silk screen, and we went to my house and we started silk screening T-shirts. And I still have this one that was one of the ones the T-shirts that we silk screened. And we brought them in about 50 the next morning. And they were sold like that. They were gone. And everybody starts putting them on. And so we said, well, we're on to something. Let's do it again. So we go to my house, we do 200 of them. The next day, 200 are gone. So the company walks the assembly line. They said, anybody wearing a Fight Speed Up T-shirt will be discharged tomorrow. Just like we did the black workers who wore Black Power T-shirts into work 3 years ago. So being kind of young, I mean, I was only 21 at the time, and being kind of young, I was a little worried about losing people's jobs. So I was somewhat not sure what to do. And then all of a sudden, my steward came up and he bought a T-shirt. Then my chief steward came up and bought a T-shirt. And then the vice president of the union came up and bought a T-shirt. And they went and announced to everybody on the line that they were wearing theirs in the next day. So the next day, you could see them up and down the assembly lines. And what it did is just fuel the people riding the line so that, you know, it was nothing but repairs were coming off the assembly line. I also learned two lessons. One was I was in the generation that thought that anybody over 35 was a sellout. And these guys were all over 35. So I had to kind of redo my thinking that maybe some people older than 35 can be like, you know, cool or militant or whatever. And I also realized that there are some people in the union within the structure that are willing to unite with you on specific issues where they feel an identity that's similar, a cause that's similar to yours. They're not going to join your caucus. You know, that's not where they're at, but you're going to align with them over issues, because without them, we couldn't have won that struggle. The company had to come around, notify everybody that all the work was being taken off of their jobs, and they were going to hire new people for every section on the line, which was a huge victory. I mean, you know, then the word came out that LePickett, the president, put out the word that they were going to get me. And I kind of knew it was just a matter of time at that point. And a couple of days later, 3 plant security guards came up, picked me up under the arms, and like I ducked my feet in like the cartoons. And I'm like going that way, and they're dragging me out. And guys on the assembly line yelling to sit down, you know, because nobody had ever been fired in that plant for standing up against bad working conditions. But the president of the union had made a deal with the international union, had made a deal with the company that they wouldn't walk out over my job. So they took me out onto the street, dragged me down 5 flights of stairs, And I looked back up at that building and I said, motherfucker, someday I'm gonna be back here working again and doing the exact same thing. So I get fired. We had the right to strike, and we called for a strike vote, which we actually won with no exaggeration. But we looked at the back of the room and they had filled it with police. The president of the union had called in the police and they ruled that we had lost the vote. And as people started to cause a ruckus, the police made people leave the building. So, I mean, that's how dirty they were willing to play. But I went to the National Labor Relations Board and they found that I had been wrongfully, here's why I got fired. This was the ostensible reason. I left off my application that I had attended the University of Wisconsin in Madison. And so they fired me for that, for falsification. And the judge ruled, the labor relations judge, administrative law judge ruled that that was purely a cover for McCarthy-like anti-communist behavior. It was an unbelievable ruling. Blasted them for recreating the 1950s that we had finally dragged the country out of, and ordered me that they rehire me, which they of course didn't, because we found a memo in the file of the FBI. They had gone to the FBI, the company, and said, what do we do about Melrod? You know, he's building caucuses, he's like work stoppages, what do we do? And the FBI said, fire him. So that had given them, you know, the courage or whatever to fire me. Then there was a next memo that said, what do we do now that he's fired? And the FBI wrote back, don't ever let him come back to work there, ever. So I knew this was going to be a pretty long battle. After that, I went to work. I sort of had a hard time getting jobs. And I went to work at first real quickly in a foundry, which was really, I mean, it sounds weird. There was a great opportunity to learn what a different sector of the working class lives, you know, has to work under. I mean, I was on third shift working all night in a completely dark factory with in the winter, no heat. And we were making Mack truck axles. My job was to scarf the sand. When you pour molten steel into a sand mold, some of the sand is in the axle. And my job was an inspector would circle the sand and I'd scarf it out with this very hot welding rod and then fill it back up with welding, you know, with new metal. Well, it was a steelworkers local and it was a 90-day probationary period. And I was so close. On the 88th day, I get in and the superintendent is waiting for me at the time clock. And he says, Melrod, I need to talk to you. And I go over and he said, you know, I got nothing against you. You come to work every day. You're a good welder. He said, but these federal people came and they told me I got to fire you. And he said, I'm sorry, but you're fired. So, you know, then I realized that this was not going to be so easy getting back in industry because they were really, you know, they were following me to work and tagging me and reporting me. So I went to work. I had to become a little more circuitous in finding a job. And there was a steel fabrication plant in West Allis, which is an industrial suburb of Milwaukee. And I figured if I was out in the industrial suburb, that would be less out of the view. Who used to follow us a lot with the Red Squad, which was the tactical squad of the police force in Milwaukee. And they would work hand in hand with the FBI. So I didn't use my phone. I only used pay phones to call factories about my job application. And I got hired there on the second shift. So I would drive my car, hide it like 3 blocks away, you know, go to work at night. You know, they couldn't follow me because it was dark. And I got into the union on the 60th day. And on the 62nd day, there's a memo in the file that the Red Squad had just followed me to work. They had notified the FBI that had gone to press steel tank to get me fired, but I had already made it into the union and they couldn't fire me without cause. So I started working in a steelworkers factory. And in this factory, we made high pressure tanks, like oxygen tanks, you know, big oxygen tanks that you they're put into a furnace till they're molten, and then you would sort of mold it into a closed tank. And it was really dangerous and hard work. I mean, asbestos was floating all through the air. I mean, there was like welding smoke everywhere. And on night shift, it was all young white guys, very different than American Motors. It was mostly white working class young people from out in the industrial suburbs. And they were really, really racist. And I decided, I had to come up with a new strategy because it wasn't going to be as easy as it was at American Motors. In fact, you didn't even know there was a union there. I mean, the union had no presence on the shop floor. Oh, one of the things I forgot to tell you, just quickly, the story. 2 days after I got off probation into the union at American Motors, they didn't give me my break in the morning. And like, everybody starts yelling at me, the fellow workers, it's like a hazing ritual. Hey, Melrod, you too scared to take your break? You a company man? You don't got the guts to take your break. It's in the contract, So finally I said, okay, fuck it. If I'm going to be a radical, I got to do something. So I throw the taillights in. I go into the canteen. I sit down, light up a Camel, and I'm waiting as the supervisor comes running down the aisle, his face red. Melrod, you're out of this fucking factory. You're fired. And all of a sudden the steward comes running down. He says, Melrod, go back on your job. And all the stewards used to wear these little blue buttons. And the foreman says he's fired. And the steward says, back out there, he's on the street. I mean, the steward says, back on your job, Melrod. So I went back to my job and I said, that's who I want to be, a blue button steward. To have that much power, worker power on the shop floor, that you're not under the thumb of a foreman or a supervisor day and night, but you've got rights, you've got dignity, you've got respect. That's a lot about what the union's about. It's not just about your wages or more vacation time. It's about being treated like a human being, being respected. If a woman needs to be off work because she's got sick kids, she should be able to get off work. And if there's no union, you don't get off work. When I was in the tannery, I was working on a line with a black woman. We had to work 10 hours a day and Saturdays in the tannery, which is also where I was washing my hands in tanning solvents, which was part of the pancreatic cancer issue. But they told this black woman, you've got to work 12 hours. And she started crying. She's like, I have 2 kids at home and I'm a single mother. Foreman said, don't make your problem my problem, and she had to work. And that's the way life was if you didn't have a strong union. So back in into the steel plant, press steel tank. So there were all these young guys, and every night I would go to the tavern with them after work. And a lot of the time, they would always use the N-word endlessly. And I would get in these arguments with them, and it was always a losing argument, because you can't sort of argue people out of their attitudes. And I finally said to them one day, why are you guys so racist? Why are you, so uptight about people of color? And they said, and the answer was, they had all been in the juvenile system. They had all been in juvie jail and had grown up in juvie. And in juvie, blacks are on one side in the yard, Latinos are on one side, Native Americans line up with the whites, and you battle all the time for privileges, who controls what's on the TV, who gets better food. So it becomes ingrained in you, this racism, because you're sort of fighting with your race to secure privileges or to get privileges from somebody else. And so, I said, this isn't going to work, just lecturing these guys, obviously. And one of them hit me so hard, I flew off of the bar stool across the room. He was 6'5". His name was Big Carl. And, I broke my wrist. And, that led to a good story, because I told them I couldn't work. And you guys probably don't know about the Menominee Warriors, which was a reservation up north, Menominee Reservation, a group of Vietnam veterans who were all Menominee, who were back from Vietnam, seized an abbey on the reservation to demand that there be healthcare. There was no healthcare within 100 miles. And these were all armed Vietnam vets. And they were surrounded by the White Citizens Council and by the state police. when the state police were carrying 50 caliber machine guns. So it was only a few months after Wounded Knee where the FBI had killed a number of Native American activists in AIM, American Indian Movement. So I decided I could get off work because I had a broken wrist. So I decided to go up there. And I found another activist who would go with me. So we went up to the reservation and we didn't know anybody. And it was the middle of the winter. And we found this community center where everybody was hanging out. So we started going around and we're saying, hey, we're up here to help you organize. And, you know, I've been in the civil rights movement, like nobody will talk to us. You know, it's like, you know, everybody ignores us. And it's like, we keep trying to find somebody who'll talk and nobody. And then when they come to feed everybody at night from the common pot of food, nobody feeds us, you know, and it's really clear nobody wants us there. So I said to Doug, so let's go to a motel, get a night's sleep. We'll come back to try again tomorrow. So the next day we're back there first thing in the morning, and a young guy came up and he said, I was in a junior college and I've worked with some white political people. What are you proposing? I said, what I'm proposing is that if we don't bring up hundreds of people from Milwaukee and Madison this Sunday to march on the police lines on the novitiate, they're going to kill those warriors inside, you know. And it already had turned violent because the warriors, just to back off the police, they were all sharpshooters from Vietnam. And the state police was carrying a lantern, and the Menominee warriors shot it out of his hand from like 100 yards. So, I mean, they could have, if they had wanted to, they could have, it would have been a very fair battle. But finally, they agreed to do it. And they said, okay, we're going to do it. But the way we're going to prove to us that you're not an FBI agent, you're going to be the first person at the front of the line when we march into the police line. So there's this picture from the Milwaukee Journal that's not in the book because it wouldn't reprint. And it goes, Native Americans march on Abbey. And it's like me on a bullhorn with like hundreds of Native Americans, you know, and then all the white supporters that came up, hundreds of them. And they brought the news crews, which then Governor Lucey demanded an end to the blockade, allowed food to get into the Abbey, and negotiated, and they won a health clinic. So I realize my time's getting short. I get carried away. But I just want to give you an example from Press Steel Tank that's more educational than anything else that I can say, which was finally we formed a caucus, and everyone, including the older workers on first shift, were all wearing the buttons. And it like blew people's minds. The consciousness changed literally overnight. And we called for a walkout because what a business union, a bureaucratic union will do is extend the contract so you lose your momentum. We said we're walking out at midnight. At midnight, we walked out, and there's a couple pictures in the books that show some of the Menominee who worked at the factory, Black guys, Latino guys, white guys. I mean, all these barriers begin to break down when you're in struggle together. And the best example is that during the strike, we took it over because the union was nowhere to be found. They didn't know how to run a strike and they didn't care. So, you know, we were there when they were going to throw people out of their homes. We said, call us, we'll block the eviction. We won't let the police move your furniture out. But then they repossessed Eibel's cherry red Trans Am. In court, the judge ordered repossessed because he hadn't been able to make his payments on it. So everybody was demoralized. And it's like, Melrod, you got us out here. It's 8 weeks. Now, what do we do about Eibel's car? And I said, we got to get Eibel's car back. We just got to. So I said, let's go picket GMAC, which was GM's finance company. So 70 of us go out to the GMC office. And all of a sudden, 2 carloads of black meat cutters who were on strike in Milwaukee, and 8 meat cutters, they were breaking the union, came out to join our picket line. And all the white guys that had been so racist are kind of like checking it out, and they're a little confused. Who are these guys? And I'm explaining, there's meat cutters come here to support our strike. So 3 of us marched into GMAC, and we met with the manager, and we said to the manager, we want Eibel's keys back. And he said, no, the judge ordered the car repossessed. And I said, no, we want the keys back. You don't understand. He says, no, we're not giving you the car back. He says, see those people out there? I said, in 5 more minutes, they're all going to be in this office and nobody's leaving without Eyebolt's keys. So he went and he handed us Eyebolt's keys back. And we walked out onto the street. People were just, it was euphoria because people were not used to beating the system. You know, people didn't think if a judge did something to you, you could turn that around. But it was a lesson that nothing is set in stone. Nothing cannot be changed if people decide to change it. And the next week, all of those white guys went in 3 cars to join the meat cutters, which was an all-black strike on their picket line, which was really amazing because a week before they couldn't start to, talk about and this and that and whatever. And here they were marching, blocking scabs from getting in, belly bumping with the police. And it was a transformation in their consciousness. And I was looking at my old photo album the other day, and even after I went back to work at American Motors, those guys kept marching in our 8 May Day marches. They had so changed their consciousness. So I've really got to hurry now because in 1976, the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal court, orders American Motors to rehire me. And what's great is I'm always thinking of a way to fuck with them. So they give me a back pay check of like $30,000 or something, and I blow it up this big. When I walk back in on the assembly line, I walk down real slow, and I'm like showing everyone the back pay check. And people are cheering, the supervisor's telling them to shut up and go back to work. And people, even if people didn't like me because I was a radical, everybody likes David beats Goliath story, and that's the way it was. And from that point, I steadily rose up in the union from steward to chief steward to department chairman, which I'm going to just go through that one story. As department chairman, in the old days, when the unions first formed, every department had its own union meeting once a month. And they'd become defunct in our department. There were a few older white guys that used to go and drink beer and say nobody else is interested. I said, no, I'm going to show you people are interested if they have things to talk about, relevant issues. So I started putting out agendas to everyone in the department for every meeting. And I'd bring in somebody, like from the School for Workers to talk about time study or health and safety. And more people started coming. And then one morning I walked into work and all these young guys grabbed me and they said, Melrod, did you hear what the chief steward, Gathings, did? I said, no. And Gathings was like your sort of quintessential country cowboy, worked how I used to work, how to belt buckle like this big, how to pick up truck with a shotgun on, mounted on the back window. And he was a real redneck. And, he sort of had the clique of guys that were in his group. And apparently he had gone up to this one young white woman who I had just helped get elected steward. We had an election for steward. Out of the 12 stewards, 8 of them became young people, Black, women, and white, and brown. And it was like transformation in the union. It became the union of the people who worked there. And it changed their attitude because it was, and I made sure that every steward, every day, checked in with every person about, did you have a problem? Is there a day off that you can't get? What do you need me to do for you? So people began to realize the union was really sort of a living, breathing force that could be relied on. So I guess in 2 minutes, right? 2 minutes? Okay. In 2 minutes, we had a newsletter that would come out every month that people loved. And we started this column called Scab of the Month. And it was about the worst foreman in the plant. And we would name them by name and name what they had done. The first guy was Don Juan, who was a general superintendent, who had gone out one night partying in the plant, saying, I'm going to get me a piece of ass tonight, and said it to everyone. And so we called him Don Juan. We talked about what he had done. And he got busted down to foreman, a degrading 3 grades down because we exposed him. So then the word came out, one of the foremen who was a little bit nice to me said, he's going to get you, so you better be careful. So I knew he was going to get me. So I walk out to my car in the middle of the winter in the parking lot, and there's not a shard of glass left in it. It's all open, and it's the middle of Wisconsin winter. And I'm driving home to Racine in a wind tunnel that, he left his mark. And the next foreman named Steve Freeman, and I want you to look at this real quickly and read this if you would. Steve Freeman became the next Scab of the Month the worst scab of the month. So we went after Steve Freeman. We decided we were going to get rid of him. So we made him scab of the month. And then we made 1,000 of these stickers that you see here, the round sticker. And everywhere in the factory, in this department, were stickers on the back of his shirt, on his desk, on the walls. And it was like this campaign. 27 people out of 30 in his department would put up their hands to go to the nurse at the same time. Every time he'd pick up a screw, at American Motors, you weren't allowed to touch any work that a union worker could do, or we could write him up and you'd get an hour's pay. So we declared war on him, and we called it bounty hunting, open season on bounty hunting. So every time he picked up a screw, he'd be written up and somebody would get an hour's pay for writing him up. So we just made his life miserable. And one of our members was on the Union's Fair Employment Practice Committee. They came in for the first time, they went to the company and they said, you've got to fire him. And it was the first time that a supervisor had been fired for misbehavior like that. And he later then sued us with 5 other foremen for $4 million for defamation. Last thing, in court, the judge says, I was sort of like a little bit rebellious, I guess you could say. And I knew that the judge had already turned against us and we weren't going to win the judge to our side. So I knew the jury, which we had picked very carefully, were all working men and women who punched a clock or worked hourly, so the lawyer for the foreman, he gets up and he says, Mr. Melrod, do you say everything that you've written is true in Fighting Times? And I said, yeah, we sure as hell make sure it's true. And he says, well, and there's no distortions, and I said, no. I said, look, we've put on 50 witnesses who've told you that they wrote the articles themselves. And he says, well, then let me ask you a question, Mr. Melrod. Did you have anything to do with making this sticker? And I said, yeah, I did with other people, absolutely. And he said, was there a reason? I said, yes, because Steve Freeman was scab of the month. And he said, well, let me ask you, does this look like Steve Freeman? Does he have a stem coming out of his head? And Steve Freeman was sitting behind the lawyer. So I go to the lawyer, could you move to the side so I can see if he does? And like the courtroom is in hysterics and the jury is in hysterics and the judge is like pounding the gavel, to shut everyone up. And we knew we had won, even though the judge ruled against us as a matter of law that we had defamed 2 of the plaintiffs. The jury refused to award any damages. The National Labor Relations Board came back, sued the corporation for $238 million, $238,000 for our back pay and for our lawyers' fees. And so we won that case. But thank you very much for listening. I hope it was interesting and entertaining.
One of the things you mentioned briefly was when you were organizing along Ottawa Assembly, you had to reach out to people who might not be in line with all of the issues you were organizing around, but find a strategic way to organize around what mattered to them to draw them in the larger movement. I think that's a really important point you made, and I wondered if you could elaborate how you see that being useful in a contemporary labor union context.
I'm really glad you asked that question because I didn't get to that part, which really typifies how you have to interact with people, which was there was the United League of Mississippi that was a Black organization that had been brought back to life in the 70s because the Klan reactivated in Mississippi. And they had invited us to come down and join them on a Memorial Day or Labor Day march against the Klan. So we took a busload of workers from the factory and we handed out 7,000 leaflets saying we were going to march against the Klan to join us. And so we went down there. It was really a trip because it's in the book. The bus pulls up and we look at it and there's the Tupelo Police Department and out marched 20 Klansmen in white robes. They're the police. And they're carrying axe handles and they've got pistols in their pockets. And it's like, whoa, what do you do when the Klan attack us, who are also all carrying rifles openly? You call up and say, hey, the Klan's attacking me. Oh, the police are the Klan? But luckily, those Black Vietnam veterans had learned from the war. I went up to the front of the march, there was a pickup truck, and it was filled with weapons. And it was like nuclear deterrence. If the Klan started shooting at us, they were going to get back insane. So, the days of the Klan being able to just out in the open attack were no longer existed. Point is, when we got back, we put out a flyer about it. So I'm sitting in the bar after work, and I feel something sticking in my stomach. And I look down, and it's a 38. And the guy says to me, you're Melrod, that commie Jew puts out Fighting Times. And I said, well, kind of, yeah. And he said, well, I want you to know, I'm Dead-Eye Di Marino, and I'm a member of the White People's National Socialist Party. I'm a Nazi. And I said to the bartender, Midori, double shots. So I said, well, before we start talking, let's have a shot. So we did those. I said, Midori, 2 more double shots on me. So we started talking and drinking. And I said to him, look, brother, when your department had a sit down because your steward got fired for refusing a direct order, who was at the gate supporting your department? Fighting Times. Did you see anything wrong with what we wrote about that? No. Do you see anything wrong with when we led the march of 1,000 people from the plant to oppose jobs being sent to Canada, causing layoffs in Kenosha? No, you guys did a really good job. You stopped them from sending those jobs to Canada. And I said, well, then what's your beef? And he said, well, and by this time we were pretty drunk. And he's like hugging me. You're my union brother. I'm always with you. I agree with you, and it's like from that day on, he wouldn't leaflet with us. He wasn't going to hand out Fighting Times, nor was he going to convert to Judaism. I'll say that. But, it was mellow. You found the points where you could unite. And that's like what life is all about if you're going to go into the working class and be an organizer. Because the other day I was on the phone talking to random auto workers about before they struck. And I talked to a 45-year GM worker, and he said, yeah, I'll go on strike as long as it takes to get rid of the 2-tier system to protect the younger workers. This is crazy that we have different tiers in the same union. And then he says, hey, and if we can get Trump elected, and he said, he was our best president. He reduced my taxes. I said, I don't know what taxes he reduced of yours. He certainly didn't reduce my taxes, but let's get back to the contract. And we did. So you've got to, you could stand there. Some people used to believe you sell a socialist newspaper in front of the factory gate, and that's how you organize people. That's definitely not how you organize people. It's being there every day and letting them see they're every day doing the same work that they're doing and standing up for people, face to face with the boss and not being willing to take any shit, And it's not always easy. I consult with so many young people now at Amazon and at Starbucks and at Trader Joe's. And, they don't come out of my generation, which was used to fighting the system. I mean, we fought battles here on campus for the 3.5 years that I was here, and it was natural. I just went into the factory and kept fighting. They almost have to relearn that if there's a grease spill, that's enough to sign a petition about. That's a start to get people organized, to take that to the foreman as a group and say, that's dangerous. You got to get rid of that grease on the floor. So thank you for asking that question.
Thank you.
So I'm afraid we're going to have
Wish I was taking your class when I was here.
So I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. So I'd like to thank very much Jon Melrod for a very exciting talk and for his visit today, as well as the South Central Federation of Labor and the UW School for Workers. We end today on John's last note about solidarity. That's the word of the day. We will see you next time. Thank you.